I told you at the beginning that this morning is really about touch. There's something incredibly powerful about human touch. Last Tuesday, my son and I, we were watching the All-Star game. Granted, the baseball All-Star game, granted a little bit bored at times, but there was 1 or 2 Dodgers and 7 or 8 Rockies playing in that particular, right? No, I guess not. But there were some of our favorite teams, and as a mature, growing adult, I'm a Rockies fan. It's a baseball team. There was also a few from the Los Angeles Dodgers, kind of a minor league team. And they were there playing, and then they did a shot in the dugout of Dave Roberts, who's the manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, because they were in the World Series last year. And they talked about something very interesting that kind of perked both of us up. When they talked about what Dave does every single game, is he makes a point of moving and somehow touching every single player on his team. Whether it's shaking his hand, whether it's touching his arm, some expression that says to these players, we're in this together. We're here for each other. I believe in you. And what's happened in the Los Angeles Dodgers since Dave has been there has been no less than a miracle in transforming them into being such a powerful force, not only in baseball, but for one another. That reminded me, when we were watching that, of something I'd completely forgotten about. Several years ago, when our daughter Katie was at Seattle Pacific University, she was a sophomore, and there was a football game in Washington Husky Stadium. A team was coming from the east, I forgot their name, fighting something. And their football coach was a guy named Ty Willingham, a man of incredible integrity and deep care for his players. And I remembered hearing about Dave Roberts touching all his baseball players, that we got there early to watch the warm-ups, and the teams are lined up doing their stretches and a few exercises. And Ty went to every single player and bent over and looked them right in the eye and talked to him and then touched him. And then went to the next player and looked him in the eye and touched him. And it really struck me as Katie and I were there watching this man, a big-time college football coach, touching each of his players, and this professional baseball manager touching each of his players, just to communicate something to them. Because touch is powerful. It's powerful for great blessing. But as we all know, it's also powerful for a great curse and great pain. Touch really impacts all of us, but we all long for the blessing of a touch of kindness, a touch of support, a touch that transforms us. And that's where we are now. Last week, if you were here, and if you weren't, you can check that out on the web, where we looked at an event in the life of Christ where there were 2 people that brought stories into his proximity. This 2 women. One was a 12-year-old little girl, and one was a woman who had been dealing with a horrific illness for 12 years. And these 12 years kind of brought them together, and Jesus was there with them, and touch was a central player in it. As we go through the summer looking at characteristics of him, we looked at Mark 5, at this woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And just to review, if you were not here or had not heard about this, is this woman had literally no human contacts, and she had, at least legal human contacts, and she had this hemorrhaging. But somehow she recognized that Jesus was there, had heard about him, snuck into the crowd illegally, and touched the hem of his garment, thinking she'd be healed. And physically she was, but Jesus knew she needed more than just the touch of his garment. She needed the touch of him. And so he stops in the crowd and he calls out, "Who touched me?" She comes out, throws herself right at his feet, and he takes the time to listen to her story. Finishes that with, "Daughter, your faith or trust in me has healed you," the fullness of what that touch started. And that's where we're picking it up today, is there was another guy there, a man named Jairus, whose little girl was dying. She was 12 years old. So we're not reading from Mark chapter 5. This is actually recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. in Matthew chapter 9, in Mark chapter 5, and also in Luke 8. We're going to be reading from Luke 8. If you want to follow along, it's in your pew Bibles, page 1609, for those of you that want that. Page 1609, it's Luke 8. We're going to look at the other person in the story, a man named Jairus. So we have a tradition here at St. Andrews that when we read our scripture, we invite you to change your posture. And if you're able, I invite you to stand as we look at Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 42 and 49 to 56. Luke 8, starting at verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Let's go down to verse 49. While Jesus was still speaking to this woman, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to him, don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed. When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, she's not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, my child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God indeed. You may be seated. Another story, two stories linked, from deep pain and sorrow to indescribable joy. Both of them. First, the woman that had touched Jesus. But it began with Jairus coming when Jesus and his disciples ended up in that village, and the whole crowd came, and Jairus comes running in the nick of time, and he says, my girl's about to die. You've come at the right time. Please come and put your hands on her, and she'll be healed. Touch her. And Jesus went off with them. But then something happened. They're going off. The crowd's pressing and crushing into them, as perhaps Jesus and Jairus are talking about what happened and how's she doing, and we'll be right there. And they're moving through the crowd. And then suddenly Jesus stops. And if you were here last week, you saw that Jesus whips around in the crowd. And he said, who touched me? Many had touched him, but there was one that touched him, longing for his healing. What if you were Jairus? Can you imagine what Jairus felt? His little girl is on the brink of death. Jesus had arrived right in the nick of time. Certainly he had heard of him. And Jairus thought this is a miracle that Jesus would arrive. So here we go. Everything's going to be okay. He told me to trust him. And then he stops and he turns around for this woman. This woman that was even illegally being there. What did Jairus think? What did he feel? Certainly in despair, maybe even deep anger, frustrated, because Jesus, as we looked at last week, he was resolute to have that conversation with that woman, to do more than just heal her body, but to heal her soul, to touch her. And he was patient. He waited for her to come out from the shadow of the crowd. And then he took the time to listen to her whole story. Imagine Jairus. Wow. His little girl's on the brink of death watching. And then as soon as Jesus says to this woman, he gives her a new name. He calls her daughter. Your trust in me has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. That's what Jesus said. And as soon as he finished with this tender moment with a woman, Jairus' family or friends or somebody had come running, And they saw the scene, and they said to Jairus, too late, done. She's gone. Then this sarcastic comment. You don't have to bother that teacher anymore. He's let you down, Jairus. Doesn't he care? So Jesus just looked at him and he said, Jairus, I'm here. Trust me. Your daughter will be healed, I promise. What's going on inside Jairus? What's he feeling? But he believed him. He started hurrying. And Jesus' friends called the disciples. They're following along. And they get to the house. And all these people are wailing and mourning. That's because at that time in history, in that part of the world, bodies would decompose rather rapidly. And so as soon as somebody would pass away, then people would come and gather. And their ritual was to actually have paid, hired musicians and mourners. People that were paid and hired to wail and mourn, to somehow bring something, we can't even understand that in the way that we live, some help, some comfort to the family. So these professional mourners were there. And so as Jesus is walking into the house, he says, you can stop now, you're done, we're okay. She's not dead, she's asleep. This is what was not a diagnosis, it was a prescription of what was going to happen. It was a description of what he was going to do. So he walks in the house. He takes 3 of his friends, Peter, James, and John, and the mom and Jairus. And they go in the house. And Jesus leans over to her. And what we read in Luke is also in Mark. It's also in Matthew. All 3 accounts include this. He took her by the hand. In Mark and Luke, he says this, little girl, wake up. Talitha cum, that's in Mark chapter 5. That's the Aramaic, the dialect. And it's what you'd say to a little child who's sleeping. You want to wake her up, you go in tenderly. And he took her hand and he said, Talitha cum, wake up, arise. And she jumped up. And in Luke it says, we read it, her spirit returned. Wow. Her spirit returned. Now what's really important about this is she was not resuscitated. She wasn't sort of dead. She wasn't in some kind of coma with some brain functioning, perhaps slowing down or not present, but everything else working. She was actually gone. She didn't see a bright light, go to heaven for 2 weeks, write a book and a feature film about it. It wasn't sort of dead, kind of dead. She was literally gone. Her spirit had left her. She was dead. She was resurrected. The miracle of that resurrection. He raised her from being dead. And then he said, give her something to eat. Give her something to eat. And then he said this kind of rather strange thing. He did this a lot after miracles, especially early on. He said, hey, don't tell anybody. Shh, keep it kind of quiet. And people have wondered what that's about. Scholars call it the Messianic Secret. Here's what it means, is that Jesus was on his own timetable to the cross. He was not going to let the crowds force his hand of his timetable. But it happened anyway. In the Gospel of Matthew, in this same event, we read that the popularity, the whole news about it had spread through the whole region. Such a big deal. Boy, the emotions that Jairus and his wife went through, even the disciples, asking that difficult human question, do you care? He's standing there watching Jesus talk to the woman, and he's got to be asking that question that is part of condition. It's all of us that ask that when we get desperate enough. Do you care? In this text, there's the significance of this 12-year gap. The woman had suffered for 12 years, and the little girl, she had given them joy for 12 years. So that's one connection they have. But the deeper connection they share in this event that occurred that day was they both were without hope. They both had lost all opportunity, all possibility of human beings to come alongside and help. But God had come. It's the center of our faith. Jesus Christ was there. He's present. And that also bound these two together for all of time. But that deep question still lingers for all of humanity, for each of us. When we get desperate enough, does God care? Does he care? Even the disciples. We read just a few verses before this in Luke 8. And this is also talked about in Mark chapter 4, if you want to look that up later. That the disciples get in a boat with Jesus at some point, and they're going across this lake, and a furious squall, a big storm kind of came up out of nowhere. We read in Mark's account of it that Jesus was asleep in the stern on a cushion. And as the wind and the waves are crashing, the disciples get scared. Most of them were fishermen. They were very used to this kind of thing, but it had gotten so bad that they were frightened out of their minds. So all of them, in the Gospel of Mark, it says all the disciples come to Jesus, literally scream at him, and here's what they say: "Don't you care that we're about to drown?" Wow. You ever felt that? I have. I've yelled that at God once or twice in my life when I've been so desperate, so much struggle, so little understanding, so little hope. Don't you care in the midst of this? When we lived in Denver for 11 years, several years ago, and I worked for Young Life for a season, and I was the regional director for this organization called Young Life, and so I got to know a lot of the youth ministry type folks in Denver, and still had these relationships that I started teaching at Denver Seminary, youth ministry actually, which is an amazing degree, MA in youth ministry, egg and armpit relay, how to avoid parents in the parking lot, some of those things, master's degree. And so I still have these relationships with the youth ministry people all over Denver. And I was at this one kind of breakfast meeting with several of us. This is in the early 90s. And one of our number, a guy I knew pretty well, came to the breakfast meeting. He was just kind of quiet. And all of a sudden he started weeping and then burst out just sobbing. We said, we obviously stopped talking and said, what's going on? And the guy began to share a little story that had occurred to him in the last few weeks. We knew his wife was pregnant with their first child, but he started to reveal to us what had happened. She went into some kind of early labor, and for some reason they gave her a transfusion of blood. And in the early 90s, we didn't understand about this, but what he shared with us that day was his wife and infant child that was just born were both infected with the AIDS virus. And then there was no hope. We had no idea what to do with AIDS. And as he's weeping, we're trying to comfort him. It just so happens that I'm reading the book that Philip Yancey wrote that we're going to do the class next in just a few weeks on Sunday mornings. You ought to come to that. It'll be great. Our own Stan Jantz is going to teach it. And Philip Yancey was a friend of ours. Philip and Janet, we were in a small group together. He was compiling his notes for that book, The Jesus I Never Knew. This summer, I've been rereading that book. It's outstanding. And I come to this part where he writes about this guy, this friend of mine. Prior to writing the book, The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip's most famous book was Where's God When It Hurts? Asking the same question, do you care? And he writes about this friend of mine had called him and asking, what do I tell my kids? I'm a youth pastor. How can I give them hope in Jesus when this has happened? Well, Philip writes this in his book, Jesus I Never Knew. One question no longer gnaws at me as it once did, a question that I believe lurks behind most of our issues with God. Does God care? I know of only one way to answer that question, and it has come through my study of the life of Jesus. In Jesus, God gave us a face. And I can read directly in that face how God feels about people like the youth pastor who called me. Here's what we can know, and this is throughout the scriptures. God has promised us his presence. We're looking this summer at the characteristics of Jesus. We're trying to wipe an old picture clean. Maybe you have a picture of Jesus, kind of like a Jesus on the Sunday school wall with long stringy hair, deep green eyes from north of Norway. middle name Sven, as opposed to the one who has come, the most powerful, the most central figure of all of history. That's why we're reading Matthew 5, 6, and 7 as a congregation every week to hear his words. And we are also looking at him every week this summer to get to know this one. Here's what we know, is he is present. That's what he said to Jairus. I'm here, trust me. But even if he's present, he even promises that in Matthew 28, I'm with you. I'm with you to the end of the age. But even if he's present, it doesn't really answer the question of does he care? It doesn't quite get at the affect of what we're looking for. His presence is wonderful, but it can be frightening. Even the woman was scared and shaking all over when she threw herself at his feet in this event. But we do know he cares. How do we know? Philip answers this as well a few pages later. I find it strangely comforting that when Jesus faced pain himself, he responded much as I do. He did not pray in the garden, "Oh Lord, I am so grateful that you have chosen me to suffer on your behalf. I rejoice in that privilege." I hear a lot of Christians kind of talk that way. No. He experienced sorrow, fear, abandonment, and something approaching even desperation. Still, he endured it because he knew that at the center of the universe lived his Father, a God of love who he could trust regardless of how things appeared at the time. How do we know Jesus cared? Because he knows what we go through. He feels it with us. People look at this text, and all too often they say, boy, it's about resurrecting the dead. We got to get into the miracles of Jesus. It's not so much about him, it's about the miracles. No, the miracles point to him. In fact, the miracle here is not really about raising the dead, because he only did it 3 times. He did it here with this little girl. He did it with a widow's son when he had compassion on her. She had lost all she had, everyone she loved except her son, and Jesus raised her son for her sake. And then his good friend Lazarus. And when he heard about Lazarus, he wept because he gets it. He feels. It's unbelievable. It's without expression to know that God feels pain and abandonment and sorrow and loss. He knows what we've gone through, and that communicates he cares. This passage in all 3 texts, in Mark 5, in Matthew 9, in Luke 8 right here, we can tell that he cares, and he's tender in his care, because what does he do when he walks in? Yes, he says, Talith Kumi. Beautiful words. But in the Gospel of Matthew, he doesn't even say anything. What really matters in Matthew and Mark and in Luke, that both all record this, is what we are told is he walks in that room, and the first thing he does is he takes her hand. He touches her. He holds her hand. When I ask, do you care? He not only reminds me he's present, he not only lets me know that he understands what I feel, but he holds me. He takes my hand. He touches. Where do you need to be touched by Jesus Christ? Where do you need in your soul to be touched by Jesus? That's what we find here. He's present, he understands, and he cares. And therefore, when he touches, it all comes together in the beauty and power of that touch. Where do you need to be touched? For some of us here, there's no question, you are dealing with a big deal. Whether it's illness, it's mourning, it's loss, it's insecurity, it's pain, but it's just right there, and nothing else matters. That's where you need the touch of Jesus. Fall into his arms. Allow him to hold your hand, because he does. But what about the rest of us and the rest of time? Most of us, we'll go home, we'll get something to eat, we'll go through our day, and then we'll go, tonight, and then maybe tomorrow morning we'll wake up and turn on our favorite news program. It's our favorite news program because it tells us exactly what we already believe. We never listen to the other guys. They're evil. Fake something. What we do is we reinforce the things that already make us mad. That's why we're reading Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Maybe we ought to start there. Maybe we need to be reminded. Maybe the touch we need for Jesus, yes, is the touch of healing and hope, but maybe the touch we need from Jesus is the touch of, I got a little cleaning up to do. Maybe I need to help you to get some things kind of straight. See, I'm present, and I understand, and I care. So as I take your hand, maybe what I need to do by taking your hand is to remind you, to clean you up a little bit, to take care of some stuff, to get you on that path where I want you to be, because I've created you to be better than you are today, so tomorrow you can be my hands to touch someone else. I get this one, boy. Do I get this one? I've been married to this really cool person who just scarily happens to be sitting in the room right now, that I met on August 5th, 1980. And I met her on August 5th, 1980, and 3 weeks later, when she's about to get in her VW van to drive back to Washington, never come back to Southern California again. And so I did something that was a little outside the box. I asked her to marry me after 3 weeks. And 4 months later, we became husband and wife, December 27, 1980. It's a great story. It's way longer than I have time for now. She was smitten, frankly, that's... But ever since I met Dee, Dee's got this way of touch. She's got this ability to touch. Sometimes it's the touch of where I'm suffering, the touch of support, the Dave Roberts touch in the Dodger, dugout, where whether she just touches my arm, she gives me a hug, gives me a kiss, goes on my cheek, whatever, grabs my hair. It's just this touch of Dee that says, I'm with you. It's okay. You're right. I'm here to comfort you. You can count on me. That's one of the kinds of touch I've received from her. But she's also really good at another kind of touch, the touch of, I need a little cleaning up. I do. Those that are beginning to know me well, even birthday boy over there. Hi, Blaine. Happy birthday, by the way. But, I got a few things. Sometimes I get kind of on a roll, or I get a little out of control, or I look at my phone too much, or I do something. And Dee's got this ability to touch me in a way that helps me to be cleaned up a little bit. Usually it's with a toe. Just a little tap under the deal. But sometimes it's just the the gentle touch on the forearm, and she tries to be as subtle as all get out. And a lot of you may actually experience this kind of thing. We'll do a little touch, and the touch basically is, you're being an idiot, knock it off. I want to help clean you up a little bit. But here's what way more often than I want to admit, is when she does that little touch, I think it's the comforting touch, and I go, what'd I say? And actually, the point is, I'm not supposed to say anything. I'm just supposed to get it because of the touch. What's amazing about this is the gift of touch communicates so much to me with my wife. But Jesus is always present. Jesus understands everything we're going through, the big stuff and the ordinary stuff. He's there every minute of every day. He's there with the touch to soothe and the touch to clean. Where do you need to be touched by Jesus? Because you can rest assured he is present, and he understands, and he cares. May God grant us the ability to receive the touch of Jesus the Christ. Amen. Go, walking in the embrace of the Father, holding the hand of the Son, and experiencing the healing and the cleaning of the Holy Spirit. Go knowing that Jesus Christ stands right next to you. He understands and he cares. Amen.